Today's author had a quote on his website for actually another book that I think is interesting. What fascinates about strategy is its centrality to the success or failure of individuals, enterprises, and even nations. And I think that quote is so correct. It's what fascinates me about strategy. It's why I like it. It's why I've been doing it for the last 10 years. It allows me to move throughout any organization and make a contribution. But with that centrality to success or failure on so many levels, I just got to think that people sometimes stop and wonder, am I actually making a good strategy? Like you're making your plans for your life, plans for your business, plans for your future, and you just stop and think to yourself, is this actually any good? How would I actually know? Well, the good news is that today's author, Richard Rummel, is a legendary thinker in the field of strategy, and he takes a huge pass at it in this book that's full of insights, full of wisdom, full of lessons to be learned and to be applied. So let's get into it and talk about good strategy, bad strategy, the difference, and why it matters. Before we get started, I want to introduce myself. My name is Patrick Norton. I'm a co-founder of StratThink, and I've been working in strategy for almost the last 10 years. I started in strategy at Bain& Company and then moved into other companies that are based here in Atlanta, working in strategy or strategically focused roles. And if y'all will allow me a little grace, I would like to just briefly maybe over-explain why we're doing a book review series. StratThink has a education-focused mission. So we want to democratize the topic, help you get better at strategy, help you make the decisions on your own. That's why we offer an online course. And we also wanted to give you a sense of what we sound like when we talk strategy, what our personalities are like, how we might be approaching the topic. But because of the dynamics of the industry, because of the dynamics around consulting, I just want to take a minute to say what we're not doing. We're not promoting what this author would call template style strategy. We're not a firm that's just going to be taking a book, taking a template, and just applying it to your problem. That's not what you're going to find in the course. Everything that we build is going to be bespoke solutions that are designed to help move you forward. So we bring fresh thought, we bring new approaches, we bring new data to it. So you don't have to worry about it like that. But these books give us the basis to have a common point for conversation and a common point for you guys to engage us later on. So I hope you enjoyed the book review series. Just wanted to give that explanation before we hopped in. Let's start by talking about Rumelt himself. McKinsey Quarterly called him a giant in the field of strategy. The Economist referred to him as one of the 25 living persons who have had the most influence on management concepts and corporate practice. And surprisingly, before picking up this book a few years ago, I had never heard of him, quite frankly. I've been wondering about that. I think it goes back to how strategy is mainly taught through apprenticeship, and there's not a lot of set curriculums on strategy out there. But needless to say, I quickly became enamored with the things he's done and the way he's written about this topic. He got his start in engineering, but moved over into business via Harvard Business School, where he got a PhD equivalent, the Doctorate of Business Administration. He spent almost all of his career teaching at UCLA Anderson and retired in 2017. In retirement, he wrote another book called The Crux, which, quite frankly, despite having written one book in my career, I am not really thinking that's going to be a retirement activity for me, but we'll see when I get there. And he currently lives in Idaho. And in fact, he started reposting to a Substack just in May, just this like past May. It's pretty interesting that he's still going, even here after retirement, engaging and thinking about strategy and help trying to guide us all. His career stands out to me for other reasons, though. One is his timing in his career is extremely interesting to me. This is a time before Michael Porter. This is a time before In Search of Excellence and things that like we kind of think about when we think about strategy. He really started at the beginning of this. McKinsey, Bain, and BCG were only really starting to hit scale when his strategy career started a while ago. In fact, he writes in the book that there were only 3 books on strategy and no articles on the topic when he began on it. So you talk about him being at the cutting edge. Being out in California, he was deeply tied into tech. He had a relationship with Steve Jobs. He writes about tech in the book in ways that I find very informative as a strategist, especially thinking about AI and emerging technologies and things today and where all that has really come from. He started or helped start the Strategic Management Society, which is a academic group of strategists that pass along ideas all around the world and collaborate on things. And of course, there's the notoriety that I mentioned at the top of this segment. And he says it himself on his website that he has learned mainly through practice with big companies like Shell, with government like the DoD, and everything in between. And it really adds to the fidelity that you can find in this book. So let's get to the book itself. This book was written in 2011 and it has three goals. It wants to identify bad strategy and explain why it happens. It wants to explain the sources of power, as he calls it, for creating good strategy. And he wants to explain how to think like a strategist. And along the way, there are a ton of takeaways, and Rumelt really focuses on challenging the reader. If I attempted to try to go over everything in this book, this video would be quite lengthy. There's a ton of takeaways in it, but I'll try to bring out the stuff that really spoke to me while I was reading it and what I took notes over. My outline for it, which is what I do to try to internalize books, is 25 pages long itself. So trust me, I'm going to try and just hit the highlights here. I don't know if I'm going to totally do it justice. Starting with, and sorry folks, I got my notes over here on the screen and I need them to get through all this. Let's start with part one, which is all about bad strategy. And one of the things he does in the book is that he makes strategy, bad strategy that is, an active antagonist towards good strategy, which is not really the way I tend to think about it. And I'll read a quote from the book real quick, just to show you what I mean. Bad strategy is more than just the absence of good strategy. Bad strategy has a life and logic of its own, a false edifice built on mistaken foundations. And I have to totally agree. I don't think people are out here in life and out here in the world thinking that the things that they come up with, the plans that they come up with, the logical narratives for why their plan should work, should come up with, will turn out to be bad. I think people are generally thinking they're doing their best on a topic. So it's hard to find people that would think, oh, I don't have a strategy, I just need to build one. It happens from time to time, but usually there's already something there that is kind of showing itself off to be strategy that you have to work against. So I appreciated Rumelt for pointing that out for us. And then he talks about the benefit of good strategy. And I think that's very important to do because I definitely have been on projects where I kind of get the sense where folks have wondered, like, why are we doing all this work? We can just come up with this on our own, or we can just kind of wing it. And we kind of already have the idea already that we need to do is going back to the last concept is something that you can hear a lot. But he lays out good strategy as really a source of advantage just on its own. And why is it a source of advantage on its own? One, it's unexpected. Two, it's hard to copy. And three, it gives new ways to compete and new ways to think about the market. The fresh thinking, the kind of rarity of it all comes together to make it a very active source of your competitive advantage if you have what can objectively be looked at as a good strategy on paper. If you don't have it, then you don't get the benefits of this. But if you do have it, then you have benefit on your own. And one thing I want to talk about real quick is the hard to copy thing, because a lot of times in business, we do just want to follow competitors. We do just want to do what we think is hot and good at the moment. But he goes out of his way in the book several times to talk about strategy for what it really is. And it is design. Strategy is a design for your business. It's the design of a hypothesis for your business that you're going to put out there and test, iterate on, and try to make the most out of. And if you want to copy somebody's strategy, they can tell you all about it. They can tell you all the secrets, how it came together, and all that stuff. But unless you're ready to copy the whole design of that business, then you're not going to really copy what makes their strategy good. In fact, you need to dip into the third thing we talked about, that fresh thinking and new approach to the market, to find your own good strategy to put out there in order to win. So that was just a couple of things immediately right off the top of the book that I found appreciative as a strategist to have out there. and to have the ability for people to find and engage with. The next thing Rumelt really talks about is how do you detect bad strategy? And let me tell you, this is going to challenge a lot of people. It's going to challenge a lot of people who have been tasked with making strategies, but maybe not view themselves as strategists, or maybe not have had the training and the approaches that you need to make a good strategy. And it's going to challenge folks who are working at places that this resonates with to think about whether their strategy is actually bad or not. And whether they need to be doing something better with it. So I will cut to the chase because I think it's one of the more challenging parts of the book. If you're not really up for that kind of self-reflection and growth, you probably will stop reading here. But here are the types of bad strategy and how you can tell if you have a bad strategy. One is fluff. The strategy is just fluffy. It's just kind of platitudes. Two, it doesn't solve the real problem. It solves maybe peripheral issues or issues that aren't the material issues, but it doesn't get to and solve the actual problem. The other is that it confuses objectives for strategy. So the way we talk about strategy in the course is that it's the logical narrative that ties your mission and vision, your goals and objectives, and your tactics together. Making the story that makes all those make sense is when you know you have a strategy. And basically, Rumelt is saying here, if you just focus on that middle tier of things and have a ton of objectives with nothing that ties it together, then you really don't have a strategy at the end of the day. And from the StratThink perspective, we don't disagree at all because we teach it in the course. The other thing is unrealistic objectives. I don't think he says this directly in the book. I'd have to go back and check my notes, but some of this enters into that BHAG territory, that big, hairy, audacious goals territory, where the objectives are just not near to what you want to do. We will get to this topic later in future book reviews, but another strategy writer talks about diversifications and the low percentage shots that those tend to be. And that's where my mind tends to go when I read his thoughts on unrealistic objectives. And any one of those or any combination of those in your strategy is going to start tilting it, in Rummelt's terminology, towards the bad strategy. And sorry if that calls anyone out. Sorry if that makes you think something about your organization. It just means that we need to get to work to improve it. It doesn't necessarily mean that you've come up with something that you shouldn't be proud of or didn't reflect a lot of work or a lot of thought or a lot of effort, but there are points of improvement in it, and we can make those points of improvement. So one of Rumelt's arguments in the book is that bad strategy is pretty much everywhere, and it's more prevalent than good strategy, which is another reason why it's a source of advantage. So he takes a moment to explain why is bad strategy seemingly everywhere. And the reasons that he lists out are also going to challenge a lot of people as readers. They're going to challenge a lot of orgs if they were to hire Rumelt to talk on this topic specifically. One is avoiding choices. Choices are difficult. Decisions are difficult. This is why StratThink focuses on those decision points so much. It's a lot of work to get to a choice. Choices involve really picking one feature and, more importantly, closing off all the other features that you're going to pursue. And that can be just really difficult. So it's very easy to find ways to continue to operate without actually making the tough choices that need to be made and deal with the politics and emotions and things that come with it. But again, we focus on that on StratThink, so that one hit home with us. The other is what I alluded to way earlier in the video, the template style strategy, what I pledged to you that StratThink doesn't do. We don't just take Rumelt's template or we take the playing to win template and put it out there, a little foreshadowing for you for a future book review, and just apply it. We come up with strategy using a bunch of tools and approaches and new thoughts and perspectives and data analysis when you ask us to consult with you on various things. And Rumelt, being a long-term consultant himself, went straight at it and said that this is a reason. One day I will do some content on the SWOT analysis that may not be too favorable, that will be intended to challenge as well, but you can see people doing that and calling it strategy. And that's not exactly how you go about it, but it's a good way to get some suboptimal strategies out there that need to be optimized. The last category is what he calls new thought. I went back and read that section a little bit to make sure I got it, but I want to be in full transparency that apparently new thought has a lot of history to it. The way it hits my ears is that it's the power of positive thinking, the kind of belief in like our emotions and our resiliency and things like that to overcome a situation and just push through a situation, even if the situation needs to really be strategized on and thought about. It's always interesting to me in my career when people lean on this a little bit more because an optimal strategy behind the new thought can be quite powerful, in my opinion. But oftentimes, the new thought is what makes it to the slides or what gets produced to the company, what gets shown to the company as strategy. And basically, it ends up being a little bit incomplete. And that's kind of more of the terminology that I would use instead of calling stuff bad, is that a lot of stuff is kind of incomplete. There's more work to do to make it into something that we can do. It has smarts in it, has good info in it. It may even at the end of the day still be the spirit of what we do. And I think that gets a lot of people feeling like we just take your watch and tell you the time. But there's still stuff to do to make it a viable strategy, to make it that narrative that we can understand and use in the future and use to adapt to different situations to make it a good strategy. So that's the bulk of part one. He tells you why there's so much bad strategy out there, how you can tell you got some bad strategy, and what bad strategy is. And then he closes out part one with a little bit of how can we start making sure that we're doing all the things we need to do to make sure our strategy is good or more complete or more optimized, maybe in a bit more of my terminology. Quite frankly, calling things good strategy and bad strategy, I think can, potentially offend people who have worked really hard on stuff and have done objectively a good job at what they set out to do. It just, you need to optimize it. It's kind of like a car. You can take a stock car and put different parts in it and it gets to be performance, right? You can do the same thing with strategy. And one of the ways that you can start down that path is with what Rumelt calls the kernel. The kernel is a set of steps that take you through your thinking without necessarily being a checklist. And that's something I'm going to be hitting on later. He's not offering up a template, but more of a workflow for how you can go through the process of getting to a good strategy. But there's there's multiple facets to the kernel itself when you start applying it. The kernel starts with a diagnosis, which is absolutely an underrated part of the strategy problem. He says in the book somewhere, sometimes as a strategist, sometimes as a consultant, you spend the bulk of your time just figuring out what is going on, just what the problem is and what are the roadblocks that come out of that problem. And that certainly has happened to me in my career on a couple of projects where I spend a lot of time figuring out what exactly is happening. Once I get to the bottom of it and understand how the dynamics of everything work, sometimes coming up with a solution is pretty straightforward. Sometimes it's just, oh, well, we need to stop doing that, or we need to start doing that, or we need to buy company X or consider buying company X. Who knows what the answer actually is, but don't skirt the diagnosis, especially with companies that are emerging out of that mid-cap range, especially companies heading into maturity. A lot of things are going to be happening to your business for a lot of reasons, and it's not something you can just like discover one thing to solve often. There's usually like a combination of things you need to think about and how they work together, and that's getting to the diagnosis. Next is the guiding policy. The policy is what you enact to deal with the roadblocks and the hurdles from the diagnosis to start fixing everything in the diagnosis. Late in the book, Rumelt refers to a tractor state, getting your business to a tractor state. I think he refers to it in the industry context. So basically, how it should move and how it should work, given everything we know from the diagnosis. And then one thing I love about Rumelt is that he gets to the heart of strategy, which is it is about action. If you don't do it, then all you have is a very well researched PowerPoint or a report sitting on your desk that it will explain everything you need to be doing for that point in time, but it just ends up sitting there. So strategy is action oriented, and the last part of the kernel is coming up with that set of coherent actions that gets you to the next step. So we move on from that to part two, where he talks about the sources of power in making good strategy. And that's really all about getting you into the frame of mind with a bunch of business concepts. Like I said, I can't go over all of them, or we'll be here all day. This video is probably going to be long enough as it is. It gets you to the sources of power that need to be in your mind for how to create a good strategy. And it's really about how you want to set up your company for success, looking at processes, looking at positions in the market, looking at competitive advantage. It covers all of that. It covers what good objectives look like. It covers just a bunch of topics that you can draw from. I want to issue my first warning, or maybe this is my second one because I talked about it in template-based strategy. This is not a checklist. You don't, outline this part of the book and then go check every strategy that you have for whether it has all these sources of power. The sources of power are supposed to combine and work together given the context that you're working in, given the problem that you're trying to solve. So not a checklist, but it is a lot of good business thinking and business logic and business observations that you can use to create a good strategy when looking at a bespoke problem. He also talks about, in this section, dealing with inertia and entropy, as he calls it. Inertia is everything you understand it to be in business. Inertia, if you understand that, once a decision is made, you get stuck on it. You end up not being able to move as easily or move as flexibly as you think you should, or even maybe as you say you should be able to do. And that's the inertia. The entropy is an interesting thing because it talks about how management systems kind of break down over time and kind of start looking more messy over time, kind of like I don't know if this is from the book or just the way I've been thinking about it, but kind of like how like a tree branch and how like nature will overtake a building and roots will start growing in and branches will start growing in everywhere. I think he does describe that as inertia. That's basically what happens to your management practices. And having to go through and prune your management practices to get them working in the way that you want is another very important step in making sure you have good strategy that's going to execute. And then I think he ends part two on a case about good strategy, which, having written a book that needed to look for an example of good strategy, I know how difficult it can be. But lo and behold, he points to NVIDIA. NVIDIA, who is having a moment in this AI moment right now. He talks about back in 2011 how NVIDIA is positioning itself for good strategy. And that almost proves the point. It's almost good that you found this book at this point because it just shows how good strategy will stack. Even if it doesn't totally work out the way you expect or the way that you want, putting yourself in good positions all along the way and making good decisions all along the way can have you even more prepared to take over a big moment when it comes to you. So let's move into part three of the book. And this part is about thinking like a strategist, which I only learned recently was a bit of a debate in the field of strategy. I don't know if it ever got settled one way or the other, but some people think it's a very innate thing. Obviously, StratThink thinks it can be taught. That's why we have an online course. And obviously, Rumelt thinks it can be taught as well. So he writes about this topic and he makes 5 major points about it. And it all centers around, for the most part, about how to be more scientific and how to make better judgments. Because so much in strategy is a judgment call. Even how much work we've done to make it a good strategy versus overworking to make a good strategy is a judgment call. And that's really where he starts, is how to improve your strategic judgments in your thinking. He thinks this, and to quote the book a little bit, he thinks this is the personal skill that is more important than anyone's so-called strategy concept, tool, matrix, or analytical framework. It is the ability to think about your own thinking and to make judgments about your own judgments. I wanted to read that quote because that spoke so much to me as a strategist, because so many times I think we just move on from situation to situation to situation without reflection about whether we're getting better, whether the quality of our experience is getting better. And obviously, I'm not one to do it because this spoke to me so much, because I tend to review my work quite a bit in order to continue this lifelong continual improvement in strategy. But he also encourages not just you, but does it himself in order to keep getting better himself. So I wanted to call that out. He has other notes in here about working in more of a hypothesis driven manner. That's my summation of it. I think he says it a little bit differently. One big thing is also being comfortable with uncertainty and being curious. You have to have that as a strategist. If you're not comfortable with uncertainty and if you're not curious, I just don't think it's for you. This is definitely a role that you need that for. And he talks about it quite eloquently and talks about it from experience. And I think it's a good thing that he noted it for everyone to think like a strategist. And then the last thing that really spoke to me was the part where he talks about keeping your head as a strategist, not just chasing trends and groupthink. I've been that guy. And full transparency, if you hire me to work with you, I will be that guy a little bit where I don't just get caught up in it. I do have to look at it a certain way and start look at it with a certain calm. And when it checks my boxes on what to do or what's going on actually being real, then I will get excited or I will get concerned. I usually just have to go through my process, which can feel scientific at times, which works off of predictions and judgments, which is a comfort and certainty and curiosity, in order to basically figure out if what's going on is real. And he has really good stories in there. There's a telecommunications company that he talks about in there that he just simply says, if anyone had done a Porter's Five Forces analysis on it, then they would have known this company would not be built well for the long run. So thinking like a strategist, great topic. He handles it very well. And then he concludes the book with a no afterward. So that's just how the book ends. He talks about this topic and the book concludes. And again, I can't put everything that's in this book in a 15-minute summary or a 20-minute summary, whatever this works out to be. You're just going to have to read it, and it's just full of nuggets and stories and things that all work very much together in order to give you a sense of how to make good strategy at the end of the day. So with that, let's move into the critical review. For each book review, we're going to ask ourselves the same 4 questions. First, is it a strategy book? 2, what are some of the limitations of the book? 3, is the book well written / structured? And 4, will the book help me if I'm new to strategy or working on a strategy project at work? So let's start with the first question. I'm not going to belabor the point. Obviously, yes. It speaks to the logical narrative between your mission and vision, your goals and objectives, and your tactics, and how to make all that better. I can't go on about it. It's written by a giant in the field. It's a strategy book through and through. In fact, some people refer to Rumelt as strategy strategist, and you get that in there. So yeah, easily passes the first one. Okay, moving on to the second question. What are some of the limitations of the book? The first thing I would point to is the candor that he uses. I think when you're doing strategy work, especially in a place that just has strategy that needs to be optimized, even if it leads to a big shift, it might not be just incremental work, but they have what they think is a strategy in place and it needs to be optimized. You need to deal with people with a certain amount of respect, a certain amount of empathy, a certain amount of candor for sure, but in a way that shows off your emotional intelligence and helps people move along with you to the goal. We talk a lot about that in the course. And I think if you lifted and shifted some of this language that he uses directly to work, it might be off-putting to some. And I think some of that is because this is a book and a book for people working on strategy and for strategists themselves. So I don't think or wouldn't think that Rumelt would necessarily walk into someone's place and be like, you have a bad strategy. Here's how to make a good strategy. I don't think anyone would ever go about it. But if you read this and think you should take that candor into the office, I would very much caution against it. The second thing that I would point out is, once again, and maybe for the last time, part 2 is not a checklist. There's no templates here. This is all about how to think and think dynamically and pull these business concepts together into that strategy story and make it the very best that it can and make it something that's adaptable and breathable as it goes along and make it the very best design it can be. That's what this book is about. It's not about just picking up good strategy, bad strategy, taking it into the office, and then just trying to form a strategy. Okay, question number 3: is the book well written slash structured? I would say overall, yes. I at no point really struggled with reading the book. And in fact, some of his, and maybe this is just the lawyer in me appreciating it, some of his use of the Socratic method in the book allowed me to play along and try to almost be a student in one of his trainings or student in one of his classes and think through these things as he's explaining it. And then his cases are really, really good. And they're all stuff that he was there for the most part. And it adds a lot of depth to it. And so there's nothing here that really gets dry or repetitive or slows down that I can think of, which is a hard thing for business books to escape, because oftentimes business books want to hit a word count that's longer than the business book wants to be. And I think Rumelt does a good job of avoiding that. It's not perfect though. So one of the things that I think that I caught myself kind of tripping over, and maybe it's just because I'm not, too much of a tech inclined person. Now, of course, for anyone who's watching this in the tech industry and is thinking about engaging us, we do understand tech here. We're going to be doing an emerging tech series. But some of the stuff, when it comes down to the specific like parts of tech or components of tech that were in there, might send you to Google in a Gemini overview in it to understand exactly what's going on. But the strategic concepts that he explains behind it tend to sing out. So if you're the type that kind of gets tripped up a little bit on how chips were developed and things like that, then don't worry, you can get through it, but it might slow you down a little bit. And then the last thing is that Rumelt, I think as a result of the fact that he started when he started in strategy at such a pivotal point, early point in the field, he has a unique lexicon in that part too, and throughout the book that he refers to. You heard me refer to a tractor state being one of those, which is maybe terminology for maybe even engineering. I'm not sure, but I hadn't heard it applied to business before completely. And then there's another example where he talks about isolating mechanisms, which hits my ears a lot like barriers to entry, but the idea is a little bit bigger than barriers to entry. Starts to talk a little bit more about maybe the moat concept and strategy is what it's kind of like, but it's not exactly the terminology that you may have heard before in a business class or at work or something like that. So if you were to try to adapt this terminology and bring it into the office, you're going to have to get people on the same page. And it might have a general feeling of running up against other terms that you might have heard, but it all works together. And I have started using some of his terminology in my works, and it hasn't, confused anybody yet from what I can tell. But just keep it in mind, his terminology is a little bit different. I think it's just a credit to who he is and where he's been and what he's done. And lastly, will this help you if you're doing a strategy project or you're new to strategy? Yes, 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 and yes. I think this helps strategists of any level, or at least I can speak to the experience that I've had. I think if I was starting out in strategy and read this book, there would be a lot of things that would fill in over time that would make sense to me over time, and is the kind of thing where maybe if you read it on day one and then reread it after 6 months, you'll start to see some of it come to life. Reading it when I read it, like 6 or 7 years in, I can't remember when I first picked up the book, there was stuff in there that he struggled with on projects that I struggled with on projects. And there was stuff in there that he did better in situations that I didn't do. And then there was stuff in there where I was fortunate enough to do better in a situation that he encountered. And it just added to a certain degree a little bit of what at least I haven't found a ton of in the field, a little bit of camaraderie to the common experiences that we all go through when you're reading it. And it's like, wow, if this can happen to a giant in the field, then there's no shade, no concern for it happening to me. So I think at different stages, you'll see it at different ways. I think if you're sitting there at work about to start a project, knock out that part one as soon as possible and get an understanding of what you need to do, and then let part 2 and 3 kind of fill in over time. That is actually, I just realized I skipped over something from the last part, but I'll say it right now. That is actually a bit of an issue with the book that you could point out, is that the narrative question raised by the title is more or less answered in part 1 and only expanded upon in part 2 and 3. But I totally forgive him for that, for the same reason that I mentioned before, is that business books can get repetitive. And instead of being repetitive and trying to make part one a 65,000, 70,000 word length feature, he goes ahead and solves it and then gets you on to making better strategy by talking about other aspects of it. I think that was the best thing to do with it. I appreciate the decision. And it makes it easy for you to use when you're new and when you're doing a strategy project at work. So I'll jump right into the recommendation. Obviously, I've been talking glowingly from the book about the book and the author from the intro. So it's a yes. Please read this book. I think it will help a lot of people. I think if you read the book in conjunction with our class, it will help. I think if you read the book in conjunction with doing this stuff, it will help. So it is a big time StratThink yes recommendation. And yeah, I hope you all read it. And if you do read it, I hope you come back to this video and comment below, whether you find it on LinkedIn or YouTube, what you thought of it, whether you thought this review was right, what you would add to the review, if you somehow hated it, if you somehow even loved it more than me. I'd like to hear that as well. So yeah, pick it up and check it out. So that's it for our first book review. If there are books that you would like for us to review, also add those in the comments on LinkedIn or YouTube or wherever you find this. We are not limited to strategy books. So if there's any business books you want us to look at, just know that we'll probably say no to the first question that we have in our critical review. But we're happy to review a lot of topics. So just let us know. And of course, if you like the way that we talk strategy and business psychology and are looking to make the decisions to move your business forward and get unstuck from the business problems that you are facing, then head over to StratThink.co. At StratThink.co, you can check out all of our offerings. We have online courses that are self-led and partnered. We have a bunch of different workshops, and we offer traditional, classical, project-based consulting and individual consulting. All of our solutions are bespoke and are designed to move you forward. Head over to StratThink.co and fill out the contact form or reach out via the admin email or reach out to us on LinkedIn or any way that you know to get in contact with us. We'd love to talk to you and set up an engagement. Until then, thank you for watching this book review, and I wish you all nothing but the best.